Jobs change lives in ways that subsidies never can, yet employers don't speak up. It's been quite frustrating for me over the last 15 years. Now, employers don't speak up because we don't have time. Employers don't speak up because we have fear of punitive, regulators can be punitive. But sometimes I have a cheeky story when people ask me that why do you keep spending 30% of your time on public policy and everybody else is sort of, there's this old story about this guy who has two wives. It's sort of a sexist story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. And he dies, and then one wife is happy, is breaking her bangles and pulling her hair and saying usko wapas le aao, and one other wives is just happily hanging out and drinking coffee. So they asked the other woman, you don't want your husband back or what? She said, Arre uska aayega to mera bhi aa jayega yaar, let her do all the work. We have a bit of a free rider problem in Indian employers, and we only get together when crap like the Provident Fund and other stuff happens. I think that's a mistake. I think that the future of India is linked to formal employment. I think the binding constraint for a $5 trillion economy are formal employers. And it's sort of, one of the, I don't know whether you've been following what's happening in Hong Kong. I'm a big China watcher because obviously I have China envy, but I also have sort of an interest in what their problems are. And one of the most interesting posters in Hong Kong, which some of the protesters have been carrying around, is Be Water by Bruce Lee. I don't know whether, I didn't know this, but one of his fundamental philosophies of Bruce Lee, I just got his biography after that to read it, was be water. Right? That water is more powerful than fire, consistency is more important than, episodic sort of stuff. And I think that's really applicable to stuff like the India Employer Forum. I think, we don't speak up enough, we don't have a place at the table very often in rules that affect us very deeply. And I think primarily it is out of fear. It is a belief that, by ignoring the crappy labor inspector or the Provident Fund or ESI or any one of that sort of regulatory cholesterol in labor laws which holds us back, or even to speak up for labor law reform, is sort of to invite attention. And I think that's a mistake. I think it's been a mistake for 50 years. I think it continues to be a mistake, and hopefully we will, India Employer Forum will speak up for all of us, because it's obviously easier to you can't target everybody. One of the lessons of Hong Kong is, you can't put 2.1 million people in jail. Even China can't do that. So it makes sense to work together. But, let me step back from that sort of, at least I'm thrilled that, there can be, CII is not an employer forum. It is an industry body. Their agenda is different. I think employers which hire people at multiples of minimum wage, which pay Provident Fund, which pay ESI, which provide safe working conditions and provide leave. To me, those are the 5 non-negotiables of labor laws. Everything else is crap. You must provide social security, you must provide minimum wage, you must provide safe working condition, you must provide leave. Everything else can be debated and is regulatory cholesterol, but hopefully India Employer Forum is going to become a voice for people like this. So just quickly about human capital, many of you here know much more than me about this. I've only had 2 jobs in my life. One was my earlier company, which I sold, and Teamlease has been the second sort of labor of love for the last 15 years. But I think even within these sort of 15, 17 years that we've been doing Teamlease, everything is sort of completely changed. So I remember there's an old story about Einstein where he gives an exam to his students, and 15 minutes into the exam, one of the students stands up and said, Professor Einstein, the questions in this year's exam are exactly the same as last year's exam. He says, yeah, don't worry, the answers are different this year. And I think that's sort of what is the definition of employment, what is the definition of education, what is the definition of capitalism in my mind, in some of my other roles. So I sort of think about human capital now at 3 different levels, right? At what's going on in the world, what's going on in India, and what's going on for companies or corporates or employers. And I think we are in a new world of, if you think about the world, we are in a new world of education. In a world where Google knows everything, knowing is useless. Learning how to learn is the key skill. Curiosity matters more than intelligence. Yet when all of us were growing up, William Butler Yeats is one of my favorite Irish poets. He used to say, education is not the filling of a bucket, it is the lighting of a fire. But anybody who went to a CBSE school like me, it was the filling of a bucket. And I think that's completely useless in a world where Google knows everything. Yet I don't think we've been able to sort of reorient education for a new world where curiosity matters more than knowledge or intelligence. I think it's a new world of organizations. The average age of a Fortune 500 company when the first list came out in 1955 was 64 years. Now the average age is 14. So what's the value of a pension promise from a company that is expected to live 14 years? I mean, we all get obsessed about pension promises, and obviously the move from defined benefit and defined contribution is driven by various reasons, but one is that, you know, you can't value a pension promise. So if employment sort of becomes a taxi cab relationship rather than a lifetime contract, you really need to figure out labor laws or say provident fund which is linked to employer rather than employees. I mean, one of the reasons why out of 100 million provident fund accounts with EPFO, 50 million of them are dormant is that you didn't link the defined contribution amount to the person and you linked it to an employer. I think in the new world of sort of globalization, you know, where ideas are sort of completely fluid, but capital is much less global than it used to be in 2008. But I think the notion that labor would be global, right? The three factors of production, ideas are capital is, but is much less than 2008. But labor is a complicated question, right? 30 million Indians live outside India. 20 million of them live in the Gulf. But you know, we had thought that we would have 50 to 100 million diaspora, and I think that environment has changed. I don't think we can plan for 50 or 100 million Indians outside India. And this is sort of related to the change in what I call the new world of capitalism. You know, 30% of global bonds now trade at negative interest rates. Now, this may seem like a parallel universe from all of you, but essentially fixed income is becoming no income in a world where there is capital glut, right? And I mean, this is it's sort of capitalism without capital. So Karl Marx and Piketty a few years ago were completely wrong, particularly Piketty, because Piketty's book was based on that fixed income is always going to be higher than growth rates. And now if fixed income is no income, you know, not $14 trillion of bonds trade at negative interest rates, and the average bond in the world now trades at 1.6%. Now, I think that may seem alien to an Indian capital market where, you know, we still borrow at 8 or 10%. But actually, that's India's great opportunity, right? The world has no growth. The world has a glut of capital. We need capital, and hopefully we'll be able to figure this out. But capitalism without capital, as we traditionally define capital, is not really true. It's just a different form of capital. And it's a much harder form of capital to measure. It's a much harder form of capital to sort of target. Most importantly, it's just an important organ from a policy perspective to even define. So if you think about stepping away from the world where I think that the new world of employment, education, capitalism, and globalization really impacts India, because we cross an important milestone this year, right? We crossed the GDP of England. But it wasn't God's will that it should take 72 years for 1.3 billion Indians to cross the GDP of 66 million Britishers. Why did it take us, we can blame our opening balance, you know, life expectancy when the British left was 31. But I think there's a bit more here, right? Because we did get our politics right. You know, India was a reckless experiment in 1947. No democracy had ever given universal franchise at birth. You know, you first gave it to the landed, then you gave it to the rich, then you gave it to the educated, and then you gave it to women. Some women in Switzerland got to vote in 1972. So our reckless experiment in politics has paid off substantially. You know, India and Pakistan born on the same night have different destinies because 3 million people, 30 lakh people, I totaled up the number, win some kind of election in India. So that's the difference. So, but our economic experiment was just nutty, right? If you think about the 1955 Avadi resolution or the 1956 second year plan, which is where all the trouble started, I think it's amazing that we were even able to get here, right? You know, Milton Friedman came to Delhi in 1965 and he wrote a wonderful letter which I have a copy of, and he said, you know, I'm really worried about India because I worry that capital will be handicapped without labor and labor will be handicapped without capital. If you look back 70 years, you know, we have 63 million enterprises in India who have a lot of labor and no capital. We only have 19,500 companies in India with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. They have a lot of capital, but they basically consider labor a disease, right? I mean, basically, the employment elasticity of formal corporate India has gone up by an unprecedented factor in the last 20 years, while these 63 million enterprises. So you really have ended up with capital with no labor and labor with sort of no capital. And so this sort of, when we think about human capital, that why did it take sort of 72 years for India to cross the GDP of 72 years for 1.3 billion Indians to cross the GDP of 1.3 billion. And cultural explanations are really difficult for me. Cultural explanations for poverty are at best the, soft bigotry of low expectations, and at worst they are racism. I mean, I landed for my US in August '94. By September, I was asking myself, these Americans aren't smarter than us. Why are they richer than us? I mean, clearly I can kick their ass individually at Wharton, but yet Joe Sixpack, who watches college football and drinks beer, makes $50,000 a year, and Ram Bharose, who works all day, makes 50,000 rupees a year. It's actually in productivity, and productivity is really human capital. Productivity of India is poor because of low formalization, no financialization, low industrialization, low urbanization, and low human capital. Human capital is captured in formalization. We have 63 million enterprises, 12 million of them don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million registered for GST, only 8 million pay GST, only 1 million pay Social Security, and only 19,500 companies in India have paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So 63 million enterprises means nothing if it only translates to 19,500 companies. So formalization is where our human capital is low. Urbanization is clear because human capital tends to reside in cities. I may sound racist, but cities have been economic engines, and we only have 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China now has 375 cities. We have 6 lakh villages. 2 lakh of those villages have less than 200 people. Highly unlikely you'll be able to create large-scale and sustainable human capital in a village with 200 people. Financialization, obviously spend a lot of time on this in my RBI avatar, and India's credit to GDP ratio is 50%. Arunachal is 1%. Bihar is 17%. Now, China's 300% credit to GDP ratio is probably the wrong number, but 100% is the average, and financialization is a very important part of human capital. Industrialization is obviously non-farm jobs. I'm not making the case for manufacturing, though I think our manufacturing employment at 11% is wrong. But essentially, 50% of our labor force in agriculture only produces 15% of our GDP, and that really reflects low human capital. And obviously, the most important part of human capital is just human capital, right? Schools, colleges, and the skill system. Now, let me just jog your memory about our school system. 265 lakh kids take the class 10th exam every year, 105 lakh fail. 160 lakh kids take the class 12th exam every year, 80 lakh fail. Of the 80 lakh who pass class 12, 50 lakh get into college, and 30 lakh disappear. And I'm not even talking about the kids who drop out before class 10. So obviously we have a problem with the school system. And I really think in a world where soft skills are more valuable than hard skills, or the skill premium may really reflect the school premium, because reading, writing, and arithmetic, to which you add the 4th R of relationships, is actually something schools teach you in 12 years. We can't teach you in 3 years or 3 months how to be curious, confident, risk-taker, team player. We can teach you to be a barbender, a mason, a customer service person, or a salesperson, but we can't teach you how to be creative. So school is really important. Obviously, college is important for various reasons, but college isn't what it used to be, right? 60% of taxi drivers in Korea now have a college degree. 31% of Walmart checkout clerks in the US have a college degree. 15% of high-end security guards in India have a college degree. Yet college matters. And Michael Spence got his Nobel Prize for the social signaling value of college. I went to Wharton. Wharton's a good place to be at, but it's a better place to be from, right? The fundamental value is being from IIT, not being at IIT or at IIM, or, and we must recognize that. Employers use, Michael Spence got his Nobel Prize, which is a fantastic thesis if you want to read it, about the signaling value of higher education. So, but college matters, but college doesn't matter in certain levels. I had a BA in English, I think it was in Kanpur or Ottawa a few years ago, shoving his certificate in my face, and I kept asking him questions in English, and he kept answering me in Hindi. I said, English is like Windows, it's an operating system. your wage premium is 100% higher. Why are you answering me in Hindi? I can understand other people. He said, "Aapko sach bataun sir, maine apna BA English Hindi mein kiya hai." It is possible. It's not only possible, it is a reality where the ayatollahs of education should be hung from the nearest sort of pole. But so if you think about India's sort of framework of urbanization, where we need more cities than 1 million people for human capital, we need less people working on farms. The only way to help farmers is to have less of them. Formalization, we can't have 63 million enterprises translating only to 19,500 companies, and obviously human capital. So, in sort of at the bottom of this, for me, is the most fascinating part, right? As an entrepreneur, is the world of companies. And in this context, I think, it's been fascinating. The most interesting question for me as an entrepreneur, because as an entrepreneur, there are two kinds of companies you can create: a baby and a dwarf. Both are small, but one is going to grow, the other is going to sort of stay there. The difference between a baby and a dwarf is not more food, it's not more money, And I have had the pleasure of creating a baby and a dwarf, right? My first company was 50 crores in 5 years. My next one is 4,000 crores in 10 years. And so one was a dwarf and one was a baby. And I obviously reflect hard on what is the difference between a baby and a dwarf. And India is a nation of corporate dwarfs, right? 63 million enterprises only translate to 19,500 companies with more than, in an economy of $2.5 trillion, if $1.5 million as paid up capital is only 19,500, there's something wrong. Now, you can blame it all on regulatory cholesterol, which I blame an important part on. But I think we have to really think about this transition that India is going through, right? As an entrepreneur, obviously, there's an internal transition all of us go through in human capital, right? Because if you convert a high energy startup into a bureaucratic institution too early, you take away its birthright. But too late, you take away its destiny. So there is an interesting transition within sort of, let's not idealize small companies. I've never met a small company that doesn't want to be a big company. But we obviously know the cholesterol and arthritis that sets in with a big company and drives us all crazy, like it's driving me crazy now in my company. But I think that transition between, are we talking about small and big? Are we talking about fast or slow? Are we talking about old or young? That's an interesting transition. But fundamentally, I don't think companies in India have traditionally, or entrepreneurs in India have traditionally thought of their three distinct roles. Our role as shareholder is different from our role as board member, which is different from our role as executive. We thought they were concurrent. We thought one depended on the other. And I think one of the most important lessons that we're getting is that those are three distinct roles. As a shareholder, you care only about performance or market cap. Let's say as a listed company now, I care about that. My investors do. As board member, you have to care about resilience as much as performance, right? Getting the next quarter and the next quarter century right. It's a real struggle. People, when they talk to me, they say, oh, you're only focused on the next quarter century, but now you're on a listed company, you need to focus on the next quarter. I agree there's a balance needed, but I don't really see the contradiction in the way that I was told I would see it 3 years after being a listed company. It is difficult, but it's not impossible to strike that right balance. And I think as CEO, obviously all you care about is performance. But this has important implications for the way we talk about human capital among entrepreneurs, right? I mean, Bhushan Steel's, so we have to be less debt, we have to be less diversified. We have to be very careful about the tone from the top, right? Why is there such a governance premium in today's stock market? There are only two premiums in India's stock market. There's a growth premium and there's a governance premium. You can map every company today by that. And it's fascinating, one of them, on our IPO roadshow 3 years ago, JP Morgan Asset Management in Hong Kong is a big IPO investor, and I went and pitched to him 3 times, and he didn't buy our shares. And he just bought 5% of the company a few weeks ago. So I called him up. I said, Rukshad, I thought your business was buy low and sell high. I came to sell it to you at 700 rupees. You've just bought 5% of the company at 4 times that price. What is wrong with you? He says, Ab mujhe malum hai tum chor nahi hai. I thought that was a really insulting but also very insightful thing. He says, every company in India is in such a big market that if you make mistakes, minority investors will never lose money. But if you steal from us, we will never make money. And that is really our problem, that we have to, from far away, we have to buy. So the governance premium and growth premium is sort of, to me, a no-brainer, at least for people of our generation who only own between 15 and 20% of our companies, right, by the time we've raised 3 rounds of private equity. But fascinatingly, in RBI, all the 12 companies and 28 which we put in bankruptcy, all of them own 65% of the equity. How is that possible? Bhavesh only owns 6% of Ola, Sachin owns 5% of, we compare notes, Sachin owns 5% of Flipkart, Quicker, they own 9%. And actually, I stepped back and looked globally. Jack Ma only owns 9% of Alibaba. Jeff Bezos only owns 14% of Amazon. So Reed Hastings of Netflix only owns 4% of the company. So it's not like you could have to own 55 or 70% of the company to create great companies, and you have to partition in your sort of head. But I think that this sort of less debt, less diversified, more intangible assets rather than fixed assets is not a passing shower. It is climate change for corporate India. We have to recognize that intangible assets are valued much more than physical assets ever were. And so, at least from my vantage, if you think about the world right now, I think the historians warn against a disease called presentism. Is Richard Armitage. I love. He's one of my favorite professors at Harvard. And presentism is a disease where you believe today's circumstances are so unique and so special and never been faced by any generation before. Actually, there's been no time in human history when we have done so well. When we are so healthy, when there's less violence, when there are less murders. I mean, you take any metric you want, the world is much better than it was 5, 10, 15, 50 years ago, despite the sort of noise that you hear. If you think about India, India is not the most powerful or the most important country in the world, but it has strong claims to be the most interesting country in the world. We have created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. But the question is, why haven't we created the world's largest economy? And I think we're on our way, right? The $5 trillion is a absolutely doable and immediate goal. I think we should be starting to think about the binding constraint for a $10 trillion economy, which is really civil service reform, in my mind. Jawaharlal Nehru used to say the Indian civil service is neither Indian nor civil nor a service, and I sort of agree with him. We will be launching a website in 2 weeks called teamleasecompliance.com, because I'm sick and tired of people not believing me, where we are going to put in public domain 57,000 compliances, 3,100 filings, which change 15 times a day. So it'll be a live website where people who want to dispute us can dispute it, but we're going to put this in power. It took us a long time to put this together. So it's all laws, all states, all industries. It'll be in one place, and then let's see whether the Indian civil service is sort of able to dispute that. But so if you think about the world being a better place, I think India it's a unique time to be in India. When I landed in the US in 1994, there was a front page article in the Wall Street Journal which said that India is more interesting than important. I hope that journalist is eating the newspaper on which he wrote that, because at least I think what's happening in India isn't once in a decade or once in a millennium. It's really once in the lifetime of a country. But we have to sort of be very careful about this crossroads that we're at, right? I worked in pre-reform India, and the brief time, but I spent 15 days out of my month in Delhi, right? Shastri Bhavan, Yojana Bhavan, DGTD, CCN, and all the alphabet soup which none of this generation remembers. We didn't have we didn't have sales, we had distribution. We didn't have HR, we had admin. We didn't have treasury, we had accounting. We didn't have clients, we had hostages, right? that was the fundamental premise of the license Raj, that we will give you hostages and then you do. But we've never, now that is gone, we have a much more sort of meritocratic India. We have a much more sort of India where I think, frankly, a less hierarchical India, a less deferential India, and that is really our biggest hope. I mean, everybody thinks we'll grow up to be China. China was very lucky in 1978. Deng Xiaoping was very skilled, but he was also very lucky. He got a 30-year super cycle of global growth, global openness to trade, and global deconstruction of manufacturing. That's not the hand India has been dealt. India's opening balance, or our best hope for the future, is what one of my favorite professors, Ricardo Hosman, calls economic complexity. He says economic development is a game of Scrabble. The more letters you have, the more words you can make, and the longer words you can make, right? If you have one letter, you can make one word. If you have 2 letters, you can make 3 words. If you have 4, you can make 125. If you have the whole alphabet, you can make the dictionary, right? And the government provides the vowels. It's an interesting way to think about economic complexity. So he says the only sustained predictor of sustained economic success is economic complexity. Actually, economic complexity is just human capital, if you think about it. So if you're going to reimagine human capital, you have to really think about development as an alphabet where the private sector provides the letters and the government provides the vowels, and then you keep combining these words into more words and into longer words. And that's really how we think about it. So at least in my sort of view of the world, when Dumbledore tells Harry Potter in Chamber of Secrets, it is our choices more than our abilities that reveal what we really are. And I think we sort of, if you read Mahalanobis's documents, if you read some of the economic history, I would really urge you to do that, right? Mahalanobis said there will be no taxes in India by 1970 because the public sector will be generating so much surplus. Obviously, he was delusional or on ganja or whatever he was on. But from my perspective, India is poor because of that economic model, which hopefully is now behind us. There's still a lot of regulatory cholesterol, but we'll do that. And it's clear to me that choices matter more than abilities in a world where intangible assets matter more than fixed